Thanks so much for coming. I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrea Kitta. I will ask you to please tell us about yourself.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a folklorist. I actually have a lot of degrees in folklore. I have a Ph.D. in folklore, and I'm a professor. So I have my undergrad's actually in history from Slippery Rock University, and then I did my master's in folk studies from Western Kentucky University, and my Ph.D. in folklore from Memorial University of Newfoundland. So I'm a professor here at East Carolina University, and I teach in the English department. I'm not actually in the folklore department because we don't have one here. So I'm in the English department here, and I teach all of the folklore classes on campus, including a class called the Supernatural.
Wow. Okay, so you've been busy.
Yes.
May I ask, is your class, the Supernatural, filled to
Uh-huh.
capacity every semester?
It is, yes.
I bet it would
We
be.
have to think about it because it fills within, we actually, at one time it filled in 10 seconds. Um, and that's an 8 a.m. class. So they actually, like, they kind of disadvantage me a little bit by putting it at 8 a.m. because they know it's going to fill anyway. So yeah, it's kind of hilarious that I've got this like early morning class that always fills every semester.
That's funny. Yeah. And I bet there's a waiting list. People are just waiting for that to appear so they can schedule it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I could probably teach nothing but that and it would fill.
I would bet. I would bet. Fascinating topic, and I'm so happy that some colleges are teaching it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, some won't. So it's really nice to see that a lot are. Well, a number are. Um, so please tell us what kind of turned your attentions towards folklore, and why did you become a folklorist? Was it something? Was it a personal experience?
It's a lot of things actually. Like when I actually kind of like look back retrospectively, I'm like, oh, there's all the indications I was going to be a folklorist, right? But like I said, I was an undergrad in history, and I loved history. I will never stop loving history, and I love doing oral interviews. I just really enjoyed sitting down and talking to people. But when I was an undergrad, the way they kind of treated these oral interviews was it was used only to kind of collaborate with other people had already written. It wasn't used as like sort of initial source information. So they were like, yeah, that's fine to do that interview as long as it matches everything else. And I just kept thinking deep down inside, I'm like, no, like sometimes these people have these experiences and those experiences are real, even if they
Yeah,
don't match the other
yeah,
stuff that's out there.
yeah.
So that was kind of, I think that was part of my turn, at least as an academic, towards folklore, is I kept thinking like there's all these stories that people have, and these stories are real, like they're real to them, and they're important, and they shouldn't just be used to back up other things. I think they have their own value. So I was really interested in that. But I could definitely see, like, even as a kid, I was going to get into this. It was very clear now looking back. It's kind of funny. But yeah, I always loved these topics. I always like to talk to people about their stories. I was always really interested in the supernatural, even at a young age. So I probably watched way too many horror movies too young. And it's like I think that's part of it. Like I actually remember watching Ghostbusters as a child,
Oh,
and that was like the first time I was really introduced to the concept that you could be an academic that studied the supernatural. And I remember at that point just thinking like, oh, that's and of course I totally missed the whole thing where they all got fired and all that kind of stuff. I was just like, oh, you can study this as an academic. That's really interesting. So I think I was always a kid that liked to read, and I think so. I was always kind of on the track to be an academic, probably. But that was really fascinating to me to watch these things, and probably the other thing that probably influenced me a lot was the movie Poltergeist. I watched that
oh yeah.
movie like every day when I was a kid. I was so fascinated by it. And I was so fascinated by those experiences that people were having. So I started reading up on that at a pretty young age. Because I found it fascinating, and I grew up in a family that very much treated all supernatural entities, if you want to even and extend that out into religious entities, as just a part of everyday life. So I think a lot of there's this real favoring of certain cultures that don't treat the supernatural as everyday life. And if you actually look, especially at a lot of indigenous cultures, a lot of multicultural families, the supernatural is just a part of everyday life. It's
Yeah.
not this separate thing. So, I grew up in a family that was just as likely to, if they lost something, to ask St. Anthony or ask a dead relative or ask the household ghost. Like any one of those three were on the table was an option. so,
I
so I
agree.
saw that, throughout my life. And I realized that there's nothing uncommon about supernatural experience. It's that we just don't, we're not supposed to talk about it. That's the part that is that we're just not allowed to talk about it. We're not supposed to talk about it. But then everybody has these experiences, or they have these, even if they don't have like that big major experience, like the capital letter experience. People have these like little experiences with the supernatural all the time, and it's so common that it's just so strange that we don't talk about it.
I agree. Yes, there's this almost dichotomy that exists. It's like we believe, but we don't really talk about it, or people snicker, and it's like, okay,
Yeah,
we need to get
there's
clear on what we
yeah,
really think.
absolutely.
And I
And I
think,
know oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I think when you look at the TV shows, for
Mhm.
example, some people love them, some people say, they're full of misinformation. Whatever the case, I mean, I think they're great because they get people talking and they raise
Yeah,
interest.
absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, regardless of how you feel about them, they put the topic on the table for
Yeah,
discussion. And I think a lot of people I come across too, they're like, oh, I hate those shows, but I still believe. Or, I love those shows, but I don't think they're real. Or, so they have all these sort of conflicting beliefs about the shows too. Or they like certain shows, but not other ones.
yeah.
And those are fascinating to me to watch, to see how people engage too. Like I'm fascinated by how people engage with the supernatural too and what they choose. So some people take this sort of like almost like toxic masculine. I'm going to yell at it, and like I'm going to poke at it and make it angry. And then you have other people who take a much more open and almost loving approach to the supernatural. I'm thinking in particular, there's one web series you've probably seen it, the Queer Ghost Hunters. And I loved Queer Ghost Hunters because their method of talking to ghost readings and ghosts to talk to them was to come out to them and talk to them about how they were like them. And like, so they're like, hey, I think that you were like me. This has been my experience. Let's have a conversation and like, let's make this safe space. And I was just like, wow, that's so completely different than some of the other stuff you're seeing out there where it's like, I'm going to do something to make it angry and then it's going to react. And it's like, another, like other end of the spectrum, you have these people who are like, I'm going to greet it with love and acceptance. And to me, that's fascinating to see like how people are engaging with the supernatural and what they think is appropriate ways to engage. And I was just going to say too, when you're talking about the how it's sort of acceptable or not acceptable to believe in these things. I know we talked briefly earlier, and I brought up a scholar named David Hufford, and he actually talks about this as the traditions of disbelief. And he kind of talks about how, like, just like it's traditional to believe in certain things, it's also traditional to not believe in certain things. So, in sort of our like American culture, generally speaking, we're totally fine with people having belief in a deity, whatever they choose to call it, maybe more or less, people will be more or less okay with that. And so there's certain experiences that you're allowed to have, right? Like you're allowed to feel like, there's presence in your life. You're allowed to feel like communicated with God in some certain way. But like if you're having breakfast with Jesus, now you've crossed the line, right?
Right.
Like there's always a line, right? That we always like.
Right.
It's like, no, now you've gone too far. Like you're allowed to feel like you've seen something or feel like there's like some sort of divine presence in your life. But if you really see something, now you're too far.
Yeah.
Sort of weird invisible line that, for the most part, I think in some places, like the line is pretty solid. It's like, no, you can't go past this point. Now, past this point, you've gone too far. But for other people, that line is like, it moves a little bit. It's in different spots. And it all is, I think a lot of times too, when we talk about the supernatural, we have to figure out where that is with everybody. We have to say like, okay, like, to what point are you comfortable? And I think that's, we all have inherent bias in that different way, just like we do about anything else. There are going to be certain stories or certain experiences that you hear that you're going to be like, yeah, that seems legit. And then other things you're like, nope, like you've gone too far. And it's kind of funny because I, of course, have those lines too. And I try to remain open-minded, especially when I'm discussing these things in the classroom. My students are sharing their stories with me because I want it to be a space where they can talk to me and share with me their experiences. But there is like, it's still sometimes inside, I always have to be like, okay, like, yeah, it's just a tradition of disbelief. You're just like, you're being too judgy right now because of your own inherent bias. And it's funny how much that comes up for people. And even people that are really open-minded, you'll still see people like there'll just be something that they can't do, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I often think of it like, gosh, like, because people email me all the time, can you, come and check my house out and things. And so, I have a lot of communication with people. And, I mean, I have to consider things like, could this person be affected by drugs, alcohol, some emotional instability, delusional, and so, yeah, I definitely, at a point, you start judging. I mean, even believers have to judge, And I'm always, my thing is I focus on gathering the evidence. So, I really want to make sure that a person hasn't had a six pack before they've, seen the ghost. Is the
And that's one of the funny parts too, because I tell my students this, especially because I expect my students to go out and interview people. And I'll tell them, I'm like, you have to be so careful, especially when we talk about informed consent for getting someone's story and all of that.
Oh yeah.
A lot of times the supernatural stories sometimes don't come out until somebody's had a drink in them, right? Because there is so much cultural weight there and so much that we're not supposed to say that I don't know how many times I have been out at a party or I've been out hanging out with some friends and I meet somebody new and like eventually they'll like, oh, this is what I do. And somebody will tell them I'm a folklorist. And then it's like 2 or 3 hours later, they'll come up to me and they'll be like, I have a ghost story. I'm like, that's great. I'm like, oh, you can tell me your ghost story. And I'm probably tomorrow I'm going to contact you and ask you if it's still okay if I use this. Because maybe you're not in your best place right now. But it's so funny how much weight there is that we put on these things that somebody has to drink in order to tell them even, or even feel comfortable enough telling them. And that's so negative. That's not the kind of environment that we should have. We should not have any kind of story that has that much trauma associated with it, or that much, that you're so worried about people judging you. Simply because we've been taught our whole lives that we're not supposed to believe these things.
I agree. I agree 100%. And my hope is that by doing this series, we can kind of open up discussion about it and feel more confident about it and feel more accepted about it. I have talked to people who just think that they're crazy, you know, and
Yeah.
they're in therapy and things. And I'm like, no, you need to tell your therapist about this. You'd be surprised how open people are, and how many people have had their own experiences. It's not something that you need to kind of not talk about because you're afraid of the reaction. Um,
Absolutely.
So, do you have a folk tale that you like or enjoy? I know one of my favorites is Bloody Mary. I get a kick out of the ones that they do at sleeping parties and
Yeah.
sleepovers and things.
Yeah, I actually I have a good Bloody Mary story. I really enjoy Bloody Mary as well, and I think for a lot of especially young women, that's one of their first experiences with the supernatural is to play Bloody Mary, right, or to do something at sleepovers. So I was always in charge of lights when we played Bloody Mary because
Oh,
we'd always
okay.
go into at sleepovers, we'd all pile into the bathroom, and the version we played, we'd always have somebody in the center, and they would put like their hands up against the mirror. And we were always told, like the version we played was that you would go into the mirror, like you could feel yourself being pulled into the mirror.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know why our version was, because that's very different than a lot of other versions I've heard. But so, like, everyone would stand around, and there'd be one girl in the center, and everybody would be chanting. And I, one time, was the one girl in the center, and I felt like something was pulling my fingertips.
Wow.
And I thought I saw something in the mirror. And I remember like screaming a lot. And from then on out, I was the girl that was in charge of the lights.
Oh, okay.
I was always the girl that I would stand there and I wouldn't even look at the mirror. I would refuse to participate in any sort of way. I would just kind of stand there. And as soon as everybody started screaming, I'd turn the lights on. So like that was my role in Bloody Mary after I had my weird experience with Bloody Mary. So I was just like, nope, I'm out. And I'm like, and at that point too, I had seen way too many movies that had used the mirror as a way of, like the interaction with the supernatural. I had seen way too much stuff already. I was like, already like, no, I'm done.
One of my favorite movies is Candyman.
Oh yes, Candyman's amazing. Yeah,
Just a favorite.
it's such a good story. Yeah.
I recently saw The Nun.
Yeah, that had some really scary moments in it.
Yeah.
It was pretty impressive. There's so much good horror out there right now that it actually like it blows my mind how good some of it is. And it's so interesting because it's having these really complicated stories that we can't talk about otherwise. Right?
Yeah.
Like even some of the bad horror gets into like these complicated topics, right? It talks about like, oh no, what do we do if women are left to their own devices? Or, or if you look at like some of Jordan Peele's new stuff, what about racism? And like, what about, what are the experiences that people have in society and culture? Like there's so many good things out there that I think horror is able to touch on that we can't talk about otherwise. And to me, there's some of the most innovative stuff happens in that. I was actually just watching a documentary that was about sort of the history of horror, and they were talking a lot about Night of the Living Dead, and how much social commentary is actually built into Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
And it's like you don't really think about it because it's just a really good movie. But there's so much there too to unpack, and there is in so many horror movies.
Yeah, I enjoy the real the good stories that are psychological thrillers. It's my favorite genre. So, can you tell us what you think makes a great folk tale?
I think part of it's so hard to find it exactly, but I think part of it has to be that it has to be simple, and it has to feel real to us. Like there's something in there that we have to feel it, right? It has to seem like something that's real. So there has to be some element to it that just really speaks to something, I think, deep within us that we know is right. That even if there's no evidence for it or there's no reason we feel like it's right, we just know somehow that like that just feels right. And I think that's the hardest thing to connect to and find, which is why it's you can't just make this stuff up, right? Like you have to find the thing that really connects with people, and sometimes that thing's easier to find than others. I mean, we see it happening all the time, especially with disinformation campaigns online. People are managing to find things that feel real to people, and they get disinformation out, and they unfortunately people start to believe it. So people are able to do it effectively, unfortunately, in those cases. But when we're trying to do it to do it for good or for things that are more positive, it's so much harder because it has to be authentic, right? It has to have that sense of authenticity where we connect to it in some sort of way, and that's really hard to fabricate. You can't just make that stuff up. It just kind of happens.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I agree. Um, it's like sort of one of those things where, when you sit down to watch a movie, whether or not you can get into it, you have to you have to be able to suspend your disbelief long enough to jump on board. So
Exactly. Yeah.
it has to be motivated the right way. It has to have all the that whole undercurrent that um in this that you could really have something like this happen to you in this situation. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that sense, and that is not something you can really fabricate in a lot of different ways. You have to, and I think this is why sometimes when people do create disinformation, they're so successful because they're already drawing on things people already believe, right?
Right.
They're going back to maybe some deep seated stuff that people don't talk about, but that they do actually believe. And I think that's why they're successful. And it's kind of funny too, because like I've gotten in discussions with people about, our is there folklore on the internet? Are bots folklore? That kind of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, I think they kind of are, because they're tapping into that feeling that feels authentic, right? They're finding that way in, and then they're just spreading that message wider, right? So the stuff is already there. They're just spreading it faster. So it's kind of interesting to think about it in those terms of how do we create something authentic, right? Something that like feels authentic, and unfortunately we sometimes don't do it in good ways, like, right, we don't do it with the most positive things. We do it the things that are a little bit more deep seated that we shouldn't be talking about, or that we should be talking about, but in terms of more along the lines of like, let's eradicate these things from our culture, like racism and things like that. But yeah, unfortunately, people sometimes play up on that too, though. And then they're very effective because they're tapping into the thing that everybody knows, but nobody wants to talk about. And that's when it's bad, right? That's when it's
Yeah.
really bad.
And can kind of spread misinformation, and it just makes it comes at you in a way that it's very easy to digest. So it's like, oh, that must be right.
Yeah, well, because it feels right to you, right?
Yeah.
It just you're like, oh, I've always kind of thought that, and now it's confirmed.
Now I know. Yeah.
Yeah, so and then that can be so bad, and it does happen though, like on both sides. I was really interested, especially in recent weeks. There was all these sort of stories about like animals returning to places. And I think a lot of people really wanted to believe that. And the first one I saw was the dolphins coming back to the Venice canals. which turned out to not be real. and, but I knew so many people that wanted it to be real. Like there was just this part of us that was like, in spite of every horrible thing happening, maybe there's something good that's happening. And I think that's what like people really connected to is like, well, maybe the earth is better off without us, and like maybe the earth will get a little bit better because we're not all going out and everything. So I saw people that I was like, oh wow, you're someone that is very intelligent. You're someone that, but they were spreading this information that wasn't real, and I was just like, oh, but it's sort of in a pure, nice way. It's sort of the best case scenario of these things. But then of course there were incidents too where like sheep were taking over towns and stuff. So there was things where it looked just like it, so it was like close enough to being real that it seemed and then, of course, people were making kind of jokes about other things. They were like, "Oh, look, Nessie is back in its natural environment." So yeah, so people were kind of having fun with it as well. So I think that's kind of fun too. I like how playful folklore can really be.
I love it. It's one of my favorite things, and I think that it just offers so much in terms of rich culture and a lot to paranormal and supernatural belief. And so I just think it's wonderful to talk about, and you've done such a wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um, and it's just such a great lens to look at it through.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I think any tool we can use, to find
yeah,
information that's what we should be doing, right? And it's
absolutely.
let's be innovative. Let's try different new things.